Well, hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Pat Cusick, and I'm an account director with the Healthcare Partnerships team at the Muscular Dystrophy Association. I want to thank you all for joining us today for the MDA Industry Update webinar sponsored by Edgewise Therapeutics. Today's presentation is titled The Natural History of Becker and a Novel Approach Designed to Protect Muscle. On behalf of MDA, I would also like to thank you for all you do for the MDA and the neuromuscular community. MDA's industry update webinars are programs which provide an opportunity for the medical community to receive information and updates impacting care and treatment directly from pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies. These webinars are just part of MDA's medical education resources, and we encourage you to visit the medical education pages at mda.org. You will find resources such as considerations for care case studies, recorded grand round webinars, research grants, and so much more. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. John Wing, Executive Director of Medical Affairs, and Joanne Donovan, Chief Medical Officer at Edgewise Therapeutics. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to John.
All right, thank you, Pat. Joanne, you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you for this, inviting us to this presentation. We're very happy to be here to bring this information to the community. We've done a bunch of these over the past year, so we enjoy engaging with you and providing information. So again, my name is John Wing, and I'm here with Joanne today. Just going to do a quick program overview and introductions. And then Joanne will talk about Becker Muscular Dystrophy natural history. And then she'll do an overview of the sevasemten clinical program. And then towards the end, if we have time, we can do questions and discussion. I want to note that sevasemten is an investigational agent that is not approved for use by any regulatory authority in any territory. Okay, next slide, please. So just a quick overview of who we are. We're a small company located in Boulder, Colorado, but would like to state a few pillars that we believe in. We have a focus on muscle science. We are a global leader in muscle disease and therapeutic development. We have deep knowledge of integrated muscle physiology, and we novel and holistic therapeutic approaches to protect muscle. Rapidly advancing portfolio. We're developing sevasemten with the goal of becoming the foundational therapy for muscular dystrophies. We also have a cardiac program. We're developing EDG 7500 to target HCM and other diseases of diastolic dysfunction, and novel cardiometabolic targets in preclinical discovery. Importantly, though, we have an unwavering patient commitment. It's mission-driven focus on unmet needs and severe muscle conditions, and patient communities are a critical voice in all developmental programs. And I'd just like to say up front that without the patients and the families, and also without you, the healthcare providers, we would not be able to do the work that we do. It truly takes a village. So thank you all. Next slide, please.
I don't know why it doesn't do.
So this is just a quick overview of our pipeline. So for skeletal program, which we'll talk about today, we have sevasemten. It's a myosin ATPase inhibitor. We have programs in Becker Muscular Dystrophy, Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy, and then another one in Becker, LGMDI, and McArdle. The Becker Muscular Dystrophy program is a pivotal program, Grand Canyon. You'll hear a lot about that today and other information. In the cardiac program, we have phase 2 trial hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and then we have a couple other preclinical programs in development. So at this point, next slide, I think Joanna can hand it off to you.
Great. Thanks, John. And thanks to the MDA for allowing us this opportunity to speak to you all. I wanted to drop back a little bit and talk about the natural history of Becker, because this is important information that has really emerged over the last several years. It's important to your understanding, our understanding of the disease, and what you talk about to patients. It forms the basis for our clinical trial development, how we design our clinical trial that you'll hear about. And so we want to do this both to understand disease progression, to understand prognosis, which is obviously key to patients, and understand a little bit about functional change measures and how they can inform clinical trial design. The endpoint that has been used the most often is the Northstar ambulatory assessment. It's well established in Duchenne. It is also established in Becker, and I'll show you some natural history data from that. It is a measure of global function. So it really speaks to what the patients can do every day. And you see the 17 tests or assessments that the physical therapist does during a Northstar. It takes about 20 minutes. And they are things that really translate into everyday life. And, we hear patients talking about, if I fall, I can't get up, so I can't watch my son's soccer game because I can't get up on the field. Can you stand on one leg to dress yourself? Can you get to sitting? Can you stand from a chair that doesn't have arms? Because that happens to everybody. It happens in toileting. And walking and running. So it's arranged in a series of increasing difficulty. And what we find is that this decreases in a very a reproducible way over time for these patients. This is probably the largest natural history study in which patients have been prospectively looked at their Northstars over time. This is in Padua. And what this shows on the y-axis is the Northstar score versus age. And a few things jump out. First of all, men don't, before age 18 or so, not much deterioration. I mean, the definition of Becker often used is that you can walk past 16, but there's a little bit of deterioration that starts, and then someplace between 20, 40, 50, they start to decline. It seems to be relatively independent of age, but once they start to go down, they go down at a relatively constant rate. We've grayed out the top couple points on a Northstar score. So there's a ceiling effect that they are very close to being able to do what a normal person would do in the Northstar. And in that group of 33, 34, they actually don't change very much over time. There's a couple of mutations specifically that are more common in that region. And then when you get down, so they have started to decline, it's actually a fairly reproducible change of about 1.2 per year. That is reproducible in the way that these assessments are. And it's consistent over time. Now, there's several other studies that have come out, Belgian study as well as a Netherlands study. And we've plotted them all here, the change in Northstar over time versus the time. And the Padua study goes out to 5 years, but there are other time points from these other studies, and it's fairly consistent that once they've started to decline, they continue to decline. And that's not surprising because that means that the amount of damage to the muscle that occurs with contraction-induced damage in Duchenne, as well as Becker, that continues. And it really, their loss of function reflects the loss of muscle mass. So not surprisingly, that disease process then tends to continue over time. Now, what does that mean for a patient? Because we've heard from individuals with Becker that, well, yes, I've lost some things, but I hope that I'm going to be able to maintain these over time. And unfortunately, the truth is that they can't maintain them over time. They don't. The natural history is that it continues to decline. So somebody with a Northstar in their 30s, they can do almost everything. Some of the things like rising from the floor here, these are all individual measures, are things that they need to compensate for. Now, the dark blue is they've lost the function completely. The light blue is they've started to compensate. Now, when they're in a Northstar range between 20 and 29, they're starting to compensate in a number of things. Running, they're not going faster. They're climbing stairs. They have to use the banister. Able to get up from a chair. They have to use the arms from the chair fairly early. And then when they're Northstar, and maybe that's another 10 years, 8 or 10 years to go down another 10 points, now they've lost some of these functions. And that's the kind of impact that they can see in their daily lives. But it's important for them to understand that this is the way the disease tends to progress. It doesn't just have some loss of function and then stay the same, but it continues, and losing these functions has an important impact on daily life. So just to summarize, there is an urgency for Becker, for folks to understand that yes, they need to start making arrangements in their lives, and they need to be looking forward. The gentleman who spoke at an MDA meeting a couple of years ago, he started to have trouble in his late 20s, and then at close to 40, he's looking at getting a scooter. So things that really have an impact on the way one leads one's life. So once that muscle loss occurs, it's irreversible. So what we've been trying to do is to look at a way to compensate for this, to stabilize and potentially improve. And the way that we have done that is to develop a molecule, sevasemten, that protects against the contraction-induced damage in daily life. And it does this by taking the edge off contraction, basically, by even decreasing contraction by 10% in the fast muscle fibers that are initially involved in Becker. Then that can protect the muscle. And this study, the ARCH study, which was a 2-year open label study, single center, this followed our phase 1 study. And it gave us important information about safety, but also about function. And that led to the development of our ongoing pivotal study called Grand Canyon that John mentioned. So these were ambulatory men between 18 and 55 with a dystrophin mutation, Becker phenotype. In other words, they were ambulatory as adults, not on corticosteroids, and they could complete 100 meters. That was the only functional criteria. We looked at various doses. We gradually dosed up, and we looked, in addition to safety pharmacokinetics, we also looked at functional measures like Northstar over the 24 months, as well as some other measures. And importantly, we looked at biomarkers of muscle damage, because these, as you well know, are elevated, things like CK. And we also looked at other things like myoglobin, like fast muscle skeletal troponin, which is specific to fast muscle fibers that are affected early. And we looked at these over time. I'll show you some of that data. Importantly, safety. The drug was well tolerated at all doses. We didn't need to reduce doses because of safety, no SAEs. We did have 3 patients who withdrew, a couple for family planning. And we also, and here are the adverse events after a year and after 2 years. There were some falls. That's typical of and not associated with any other adverse events. The most common that we saw were dizziness, which seemed to be right at the beginning, as was a little bit of somnolence. We give the drug at night. That seems to have largely ameliorated that. And otherwise, things that you would see in men of this age. The men in general, they were in their 30s on average, and they had lost significant function. Half of them could not get up off the floor and do the rise from floor. And what we saw was that over time, when we looked at the Northstar, this shows the individual responses of all 12 men. And whether they started close to the ceiling, close to 34, or they started very low, barely ambulatory. This gentleman was in a scooter most of the time. Over the 2 years, they didn't deteriorate in terms of their Northstar, but they remained essentially flat over time. And the ones that discontinued actually trended up. So they were not discontinuing because they were doing poorly. There was a gentleman who had a meniscal tear in his knee and was rehabbing towards the end of the study. Overall, though, the Northstar, in contrast to that natural history change that I showed you, we would have expected about a 1.2 per year, so 2.4 points over the 2 years. We saw that it was relatively stable over time at 24 months, which was encouraging. Now, granted, this is a open label study. It's a limited group of patients of 12 patients, but nonetheless, it was encouraging for us to move forward. We also saw that the biomarkers of muscle damage showed rapid and sustained decreases with sevasemten. And that tells us that the drug is working in the way that we anticipated, that it is. It's targeting specifically fast muscle fibers, these three kinds of troponin: fast skeletal muscle, slow skeletal muscle, and cardiac. So this is fast, nothing to do with cardiac troponin that you hear about. We saw that CK fell by close to 40% over time, and it was early, and it stayed down over the time period. So what we hope this represents is that muscle damage is decreased, and that then translates into stabilization. We see it even more so with fast skeletal muscle fiber and with myoglobin, another biomarker of muscle damage, of the contraction-induced damage that you see in Becker muscular dystrophy. We looked at a number of other individual proteins, and this is a little bit complicated, I realize. What we looked at was, what are the circulating muscle injury proteins that are elevated in Becker? And there's a lot of proteins. This is a proteomic scan of thousands of muscle proteins. And there are some that are very consistently elevated in Becker. Turns out a lot of those are ones that are also elevated more even when you do exercise. So the redder they are, the more elevated, up to fourfold in some cases. And so that's at baseline in these patients. Now, what happens when you treat them with sevasemten? So the blue is a decrease in these muscle proteins. And so the ones that are most elevated in patients out of thousands are also the ones that are reduced with sevasemten treatment. And just like the last line, it happened early, and it was maintained out to the end of the study as well. So that's encouraging. A couple of other measures that we looked at: the 100-meter time test velocity, that was stable over time, and the grip strength. So while we are inhibiting myosin, the motor of contraction, we are only taking the edge off contraction, so that with recruitment of other muscle fibers, the maximum grip strength stays the same. So we're not inhibiting function, but we're taking the edge off the contraction to reduce damage. And that's the sweet spot of the drug, basically, being able to do that in Becker. So what we learned from this study is we saw the drug was well tolerated. It could encourage us to move on to a larger study. We saw the biomarkers showing rapid, sustained, and significant decreases, and that function was stabilized, which is very important to these patients. We were able to identify a pivotal dose. It was just as reduced at a dose of 10 milligrams as it was at higher. So we moved that into our phase 3, essentially a pivotal study. And we understood these key factors for the design of that registrational study. So this is ongoing, and I'll show you many sites in the US. It is global as well. And looking at adults with Becker, we've looked at the group that with Northstars between 5 and 32. So they're ambulatory, they're not at the ceiling, and so they're in a range where we can see changes over an 18-month period. The primary endpoint is a functional one, so this is a registrational one for FDA. And we're also looking at other measures like the 100-meter time test. We're looking at biomarkers of muscle damage and MRI. MRI is a really elegant method of looking at damage in the muscle, and it's completely independent of effort. So it's kind of orthogonal to these other measures. We're all measuring very different things to understand how this is impacting patients, as well as patient-reported outcomes. We're giving a dose of 10 milligrams. This is an oral tablet given once a day for the 18 months. And because we've seen safety to date in this and the study I showed you, in other studies, we've had over a couple hundred people treated at this point with sevasemten. We've been able to do the safety visits at 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and then 12 and 18. So these are men in their 30s often. They've got a life, they've got a family, and they don't want to be coming in for clinical trials. It's not a population that has been used to doing clinical trials, frankly. So we've tried to minimize the burden on the patients. There is an open label study that is available afterwards, and that's actually ongoing already at these centers. We've included a lot of centers because trying to limit travel. The inclusion criteria, the key inclusion criteria, men aged 18 to 50, a genetic diagnosis of Becker, i.e. a mutation in the dystrophin gene, not on corticosteroids. They're ambulatory. There are those criteria of Northstar that I mentioned, and the ability to do a 100-meter time test in less than 200 seconds. They can use a cane or walker orthotics to complete that. We want them to be safe while they're doing that. And the study, the initial study is, or visit is over a couple days. Typically it's to organize all of the measures, but then the visits are a 1-day visit to the site. And we do provide full support and a stipend, travel support for whatever expenses, including things like childcare, and an accompanying person to come with them to the visits. We also have ongoing trials in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So on the left here, the studies, the ARCH I told you, Dune will be presenting some on that at the World Muscle shortly. That also looks at a couple of other diseases, limb-girdle 2I, and McArdle. And that's to look at the impact of sevasemten on exercise parameters and exercise-induced biomarkers of muscle damage. I mentioned MESA, the open label extension. We're also enrolling in GRASP, a natural history study that we're doing in collaboration with the GRASP group out of UVA. And I told you about the Canyon study. The Grand Canyon is the first cohorts of that will inform Grand Canyon. We also have a program in Duchenne, Lynx enrolling younger boys, 4 to 9, and Fox enrolling boys who could be a little bit older who have previously been on gene therapy. So we're looking at the spectrum of disease in dystrophinopathies. I mentioned this is a community that has been less engaged in clinical trials. There is a consortium of, including us, that is sponsoring the Becker Education and Engagement Day on September 28th. If people want to refer patients, there are 6 sites across the country, and it's a full day of information about living with Becker. It is an opportunity for people to meet other folks with Becker, to learn about cardiac manifestations, physical therapy, how to do exercise, and how the disease impacts their medical care and their daily lives. This is the 2nd year we've had it. It was fantastic last year. Really glad to be supporting bringing that back. So in summary, sevasemten, investigational fast myosin inhibitor to prevent contraction-induced muscle damage while preserving function. We saw after the 24 months that it was well tolerated with significant decreases in biomarkers, maintained strength, and stabilization of functional assessments. So we hope to continue to support the community, not only clinical trials, but other educational initiatives as we are completing the Grand Canyon study that we are actively enrolling globally. So thank you. A couple of places to get more information and also for your patients to get more information on the Grand Canyon study eligibility, and to also encourage them to learn about Becker Education and Engagement Day this year. They can register, and there is some travel support for them as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody, thank particularly the patients who, their families who have participated in the studies, and we're happy to answer questions.
Yes, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A window.
One question I would say that we get asked a lot is, well, does this drug affect the heart? The drug doesn't have a direct effect on the heart. We have seen in some of the preclinical studies that there is a decrease in fibrosis in the heart. We are monitoring the heart carefully with echoes periodically during the study, so we'll have more to say about that. But that's a question that people often pop up.
Yeah, no, that's great information. I know cardiac care is one of the bigger concerns for the Becker community, so that's good to know. All right, we'll give it another few minutes here. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in. All right. Well, it just was that comprehensive of a presentation. I think you all covered everything. So, oh, we do have a question. Are you enrolling, or any of your enrolling studies looking for additional sites?
We are hoping to finish enrollment in the Grand Canyon study around the end of the year. So we're not looking for additional sites at this point, but drop us a line and see how, also for the future. So.
All right.
And also, if you have patients that might be interested, how we can, help connect you with sites that would be the most appropriate.
Okay. We do have one more question. Are there any plans to include older teens in the future?
I should, in terms of the adolescent population, in the Canyon study, we've enrolled 29 adolescents, which is probably the largest group in a clinical trial. And that's to look at, as you saw, they don't change very much in terms of their function, but that will look at biomarkers, it'll look at PK to be able to translate to younger patients. We did not include men over 50. And you may remember on the slide, there's really very little natural history data in men over 50. It's not that we don't think the drug could be beneficial, but in a clinical trial, you're always trying to look at a group of patients where you have a signal to noise that will allow you to see a difference over a reasonable period of time. So that's why we looked at men 18 to 50. The younger patients just don't change their Northstar very much in that period of time. And the older folks will have to look at and we are looking at as men get older in the extension study.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see, we have another one. At times it is challenging to differentiate a severe Becker's from a mild Duchenne patient. Mm-hmm. Could you give us some tips on differentiating between the two?
I think the definition that's been used a lot, and as in the recent, what I've heard when they were doing the recent guidelines is this generated a lot of discussion. What happens with newer therapies? Are those now Becker patients, even though because they are extending ambulation past 16 or 18? Because we know of these patients. So I think that it is in a lot of ways a spectrum that it depends on the patient's, the amount of dystrophin as well as the quality of the dystrophin that is made in some of these patients. But our goal would be to be able to bridge those groups. And so for adults, we've used ambulatory criteria. For adolescents, we have used ambulatory criteria, but along with an in-frame mutation for the younger adolescents.
Okay. Great. We have one more question. What is the diversity within the cohorts? Is that being considered?
In terms of ethnic diversity, we have tried to include sites that have populations, diverse populations. We also have information available in Spanish. We have sponsored Spanish webinars as well to facilitate that. It's something I think most sponsors are trying to broaden as much as possible. I don't have specific figures on what has happened so far, but we are trying to reach out with some of the advocacy organizations that are specifically focused on, for example, the Spanish-speaking population.
Okay. Well, that looks like that's all of our questions. Unless anyone has one final one. No. All right. Well, with that, I will thank everyone for joining us today. Edgewise, thank you for the insightful presentation, and thank you to all the medical professionals for attending today's program. We hope you will join us for future industry update webinars, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.